They walked past me every day, never realizing the man sweeping their floors held a secret that would one day change everything. People always say America is a place where anyone can make it if they work hard enough. Maybe that's true. But nobody tells you how hard it is to stay invisible while you're trying. Every morning, long before sunrise, I'd push through the revolving doors of the Langford Tower downtown, 40 floors of glass and ambition. The marble floors smelled like polish and expensive perfume, and I'd nod to the same sleepy security guard who still didn't know my name. By the time the first suits came through with their paper cups and Bluetooth headsets, I'd already been there for hours, making sure everything they touched looked perfect. They never really saw me. Sometimes one of them would mumble thanks as I stepped aside, but mostly they talked through me. Stock prices, vacations, new Teslas. I was the man in the background, the one who made the place look like success without ever sharing in it. There was a group of interns once who joked while I scrubbed a hallway. "Imagine being here your whole life just cleaning up after people," one said, loud enough for me to hear. I kept my head down, smiling the way you do when you can't afford to react. They didn't know that every dollar I made went straight into a jar hidden under my bed, a college fund for my boy. That jar was my real job. Every mop stroke, every sore back, every shift I picked up was another drop in that glass jar. My son, Daniel, was 13, smart, curious, always building things out of scrap wire and cardboard. At night, when I came home to our small apartment in Queens, he'd meet me at the door, all energy and questions. "Dad, what's a microchip?" he'd ask, waving a half-taken-apart radio. I didn't always know the answers, but I'd listen anyway, because when he talked about the future, it made all the noise from the day fade out. Our place was nothing fancy: peeling paint, a leaky faucet, 2 rooms we called home. But it was filled with laughter. We'd eat whatever I could afford: mac and cheese, canned soup, and I'd tell him stories about how his mom used to dance in the kitchen before she got sick. She'd passed when he was little, and I'd promised her I'd give him a better life. That promise was what kept me moving when my body begged me to stop. People think pride is about money, but it isn't. It's about showing up even when no one's watching. I never stole, never cut corners. I told myself dignity wasn't something anyone could take away. You had to hand it over, and I never would. At work, I'd sometimes glance up at the top floor, the one with the corner office and the constant light burning past midnight. That was Richard Langford's office, the man whose name was on the building. He was everything the city admired: sharp suit, sharper eyes, the kind of man who made other people lower their voices. I'd see him walk through the lobby sometimes, surrounded by assistants and confidence. Everyone moved out of his way. I used to wonder what it felt like to be seen like that, to have a name people said with respect instead of pity. One Friday night, the place was emptying out for the weekend. The elevators chimed, doors closed, laughter echoed down the halls, and then silence. I stayed behind, mopping the last stretch of the top-floor corridor. The air was cool and still, the city lights blinking through the glass walls. That's when I noticed Langford's office door cracked open. Normally, that floor was off-limits after hours, but the light was still on. Out of habit, I stepped in to switch it off. The room was huge, all glass and leather and quiet power. Awards lined the walls. A half-finished glass of bourbon sat beside an open folder. On the edge of the desk lay a small white card, half tucked under a paperweight. I reached to set it aside and saw the name stamped in silver foil: Richard Langford, Chairman, Langford Industries beneath it, a direct number, an address, heavy cardstock, the kind that feels important just sitting in your hand. I should have left it right there, but something about it made me pause. Maybe the idea that for once I was holding a piece of a world that had always been out of reach. My reflection stared back from the glass wall. A tired man in a faded uniform, a mop beside him, holding a business card worth more than a week of his pay. Footsteps echoed from the hallway. Another janitor making rounds. And before I could think, I slipped the card into my pocket. I told myself I'd return it on Monday. I didn't. That night on the subway, I kept touching the edge of the card through the fabric of my pocket, feeling its weight. I didn't know why it mattered, only that it did. Maybe it was foolish hope. Maybe it was fate. Maybe I just wanted proof that I existed in the same world as the people upstairs. When I got home, Daniel was asleep on the couch, his textbooks open, a half-built model sitting beside him. I tucked a blanket over his shoulders and sat there for a long time, watching him breathe, the card still warm in my hand. Out the window, far away, the Langford Tower glowed against the skyline. The same light I'd just turned off, still burning high above the city. I didn't know it then, but that single moment, choosing to keep something that didn't belong to me, was going to change everything. For both of us. Every sweep of the broom was a promise that my son would never live the life I did. Morning started before the city woke. The old coffee maker sputtered in the corner of our small kitchen, steam rising from a chipped mug that had seen better years. The linoleum floor creaked under my boots as I moved quietly, trying not to wake Daniel too soon. The sun hadn't even broken the skyline yet, but I'd already been up for an hour, thinking, planning, worrying. Our kitchen was tiny, the kind of space where you could stretch your arms and touch both walls. But it was home. The fridge hummed, half empty. The window above the sink looked out over the alley behind the building, where trash cans stood like old soldiers, and the morning air carried a mix of cold and city noise. That's where my day always began. Surrounded by the scent of coffee, fatigue, and hope. Daniel stumbled in, rubbing sleep from his eyes, his hair a mess that refused to stay down. He was 16 now, taller, sharper, but still carried that spark that scared me sometimes, the spark of someone meant for more. "Morning, Dad," he mumbled, dropping his backpack on the chair. "Morning, champ," I said, sliding a plate toward him. "Eat something. Big day today, right?" He smiled. "Science fair finals." "That's my boy," I said, though my chest tightened when I saw the loose thread at the hem of his jacket. The other kids would show up in new sneakers and pressed clothes. He'd walk in wearing thrift store shoes with hope in his eyes. But Daniel didn't care. He never complained. He'd been that way since his mom passed, always pushing forward, always chasing light in dark places. He wolfed down breakfast, grabbed his notebook, and kissed my cheek. "I'll make you proud." "You already do," I said, meaning it more than he'd ever understand. When the door closed behind him, I sat there for a long time, staring at the empty chair across from mine. Then I reached under the cabinet, lifted the loose floorboard, and pulled out the glass jar hidden beneath it. Inside were a few folded bills, crumpled, old, but sacred. That jar was my insurance policy against the life I'd lived. Every dollar in there meant one less door closed to him, one less thing the world could use to tell him no. I dropped in a few new ones from my paycheck, whispering the same thing I did every time. "You'll take him where I couldn't go." Then I set it back, covered it, and left for work. Broom in hand, hope in heart. The day dragged like it always did. Same hallways, same faces, same invisible existence. But somehow it hurt less now. Maybe because every sound, every elevator ding, every shoe click on polished floors, reminded me why I was there. This job wasn't about survival anymore. It was about investment. I wasn't just cleaning. I was building something. On my lunch break, I sat by the loading dock, unwrapping a cold sandwich and checking my phone for Daniel's text. Nothing yet. The city air smelled like diesel and rain, but I barely noticed. I was too busy imagining him standing in front of judges, explaining some invention I couldn't even begin to understand. He'd talk fast, hands moving, eyes alive. That part I knew for sure. By the time I got home that evening, the lights in the apartment were already on. I heard music, faint, upbeat, happy. "Dad!" His voice hit me before I even shut the door. "We won!" He came running out of his room, holding up a gold-colored medal on a red ribbon. "First place. They're sending me to state finals next month." I laughed, the kind that shakes loose something inside your chest. "You serious?" He nodded, beaming. "Mrs. Thompson said I should apply for scholarships. She said my project's got potential." Scholarships? The word sounded too big for our little kitchen. I didn't want to show it, but my hands trembled when I pulled him in for a hug. "You did good, Danny. Real good." That night, after he went to bed, I sat at the table long after the lights were out. The medal lay between my hands, its shine catching the faint glow of the streetlight through the window. I thought about all the years I'd spent scrubbing floors while the rest of the world looked down on me, and how somehow, against all odds, that same world had finally looked up at my boy. Weeks turned into months. Daniel worked harder than I'd ever seen him. He'd stay up past midnight, hunched over blueprints and equations I couldn't make sense of. His eyes burned with something fierce, the kind of determination that keeps a person from noticing how hard life really is. And me? I worked longer shifts, took side jobs when I could find them, missed lunches, missed sleep. Every extra dollar went into that jar. Sometimes I'd stand at the top of the building after hours, looking out across the skyline, wondering if the people in those corner offices had ever felt tired like this. Not just in their bodies, but in their souls. I'd tell myself they probably hadn't, and then I'd keep working anyway. There were nights I'd get home so late I'd find Daniel asleep at the table, his notebook open, pen still in hand. I'd place a blanket over his shoulders, turn off the light, and whisper, "Keep going, kid. Don't stop now." He never heard me, but I think he felt it. The next morning he'd be up again, chasing something I couldn't even see. One Friday I came home to find him sitting at the table, a letter in his hands. His face was pale, unreadable. "Everything okay?" I asked. He nodded slowly, then held out the envelope. "You should open it." The logo on it made my knees weak. Langford University. I'd seen that name every day, carved into the glass doors of the same tower I cleaned. My hands shook as I unfolded the letter. The words blurred for a second before coming into focus. "Congratulations. You have been awarded a full academic scholarship to Langford University." I sank into the chair. I must have read it 10 times before I believed it. Daniel was crying now, laughing through it, trying to talk but failing. "Dad, I got in. Full ride. I'm going to college." I couldn't find my voice. I just nodded, pressing my hand to my mouth as tears filled my eyes. All those years. All those nights of exhaustion. Every humiliation I'd swallowed. It had all led to this moment. I stood and hugged him tight. The letter still crushed between us. "You did it, son," I whispered. "You did it." He pulled back, smiling through tears. "No, Dad. We did it." That night, after he went to bed, I opened the drawer beneath my mattress and pulled out that old business card, the one I'd kept hidden for years. The silver letters still caught the light. Richard Langford. I turned it over in my hand, thinking about all the days I'd spent cleaning the man's offices. And now, my son would be walking through doors that bore his name. For the first time in my life, I didn't feel invisible anymore, because even if the world still didn't see me, it would soon see him. My son entered a world built for the rich, and I was terrified it would swallow him whole. The day Daniel left for college, New York felt colder. Not the kind of cold you feel on your skin, the kind that sits inside your chest, heavy and still. The taxi idled at the curb, its exhaust curling through the morning air as I double-checked his suitcase for the 3rd time. The handle was frayed, the zipper stubborn, but it held together. Kind of like us. Daniel stood on the sidewalk, hands in his pockets, trying to act calm. He'd always done that. Hide his nerves behind quiet smiles. "You sure you'll be okay here, Dad?" he asked. I nodded, forcing a grin. "Don't worry about me. You just go show those rich kids what hard work looks like." He laughed, but his voice cracked when he said, "I'll make you proud." "You already have. I told him. When the cab pulled away, I stood there until the taillights disappeared around the corner. For years I had dreamed of that moment, watching my boy head toward the life I'd never had. But dreams are strange things. They don't tell you that letting go hurts more than holding on ever did. Langford University sat on a hill just outside the city. Stone buildings, manicured lawns, and kids who'd never taken the subway in their lives. The place looked like a picture from a magazine. When Daniel called me that first night, I could hear the wonder and unease in his voice. "Dad," he said, "you should see this place. They have dorms with their own coffee bars. Some of these guys have cars I've only seen in movies." I chuckled softly. "Don't let them scare you, son. You earned your spot there. Walk like you belong." "I'll try," he said, though the doubt lingered beneath his words. For the next few weeks, our phone calls became shorter. "Classes are good," he'd say. "People are nice." But I could hear it, that quiet edge of loneliness he didn't want me to notice. It's hard being the poor kid in a rich man's world. I knew that feeling too well. By the end of the first month, I couldn't take it anymore. I'd saved enough for a train ticket and decided to visit, unannounced. I wore my cleanest uniform, ironed the creases with a hot pan, and packed a small box of food. Sandwiches, homemade cookies, a few apples. It wasn't much, but it felt like something a father should bring. When I stepped off the bus near the campus, I felt like I'd entered another country. Students walked by in expensive coats, laughing into their phones, earbuds tucked in, confidence in their stride. The air smelled of coffee and money. I followed the signs toward the science building, my heart pounding harder with each step. Then I saw him, standing under a maple tree with a group of students, laughing at something one of them said. He looked different, taller, sharper. His clothes fit better, his posture more sure. For a moment, I just stood there, frozen between pride and distance. He was mine, but he was already stepping into a life that no longer needed me to hold it up. And then I saw her. She stood next to him, blonde hair catching the light, her smile effortless. There was something about the way she looked at him. Curious, unguarded. The kind of look people only give when they see something rare. Later, I'd learn her name. Isabel Langford, the daughter of Richard Langford, the same man whose name was etched in steel above the building I cleaned every morning. Fate, it seems, has a cruel sense of humor. I didn't approach them that day. Instead, I stood at a distance, half hidden by a tree, pretending to check the campus map while I watched. Daniel said something. She laughed. A real laugh, the kind that lifts the air. I hadn't heard that sound from him in years, and though it warmed me, a knot of fear twisted tighter inside, because I knew what love could do in a world that measured people by their last names. I caught the evening train home, my lunchbox still full. The entire ride back, I stared at my reflection in the train window, the tired man with a janitor's uniform, holding the face of someone who'd worked his whole life just to give his son the chance to stand where he didn't belong. But for the first time, I wondered if I'd sent him somewhere that might break him instead. When I returned to work that week, everything looked the same. The lobby, the floors, the faces that never saw me. But inside, I wasn't the same. I'd seen the world my son was stepping into, and I couldn't stop thinking about how lonely it looked behind all that shine. So I found a way to stay close. Quietly. Langford University hired custodial workers through a contractor. I knew someone who knew someone. By the end of the month, I was back on my hands and knees, only this time on the same campus my son studied in. Different place. Same mop. Most days I never let him see me. I'd clean the halls after hours, sweep the cafeteria when classes were in session. But sometimes, from across a courtyard or through a window, I'd catch a glimpse of him. His head bent over a poor book, his hands flying as he explained something to another student. Those moments kept me going. One night, as I was emptying trash cans near the library, I saw him through the glass wall again, sitting at a table with Isabel Langford. Their heads were close together, their laughter soft, like two people who forgot the world existed. I froze, the trash bag hanging in my hand. It wasn't jealousy or anger I felt. It was fear, the kind that whispers, "Don't let him get hurt." Because I knew what happened when the rich and the poor tried to share the same dream. The world never lets it go quietly. Still, I couldn't help smiling. Love is a strange thing. It grows even in places where no one thinks it can. Watching them together felt like seeing light inside a locked room. Weeks passed, and I saw them more often, walking the campus paths, studying under trees, sitting on the steps outside the lab building. She'd listen, really listen, when he spoke. And he looked alive in a way I hadn't seen since his mother was here. Every time I saw them, I wanted to believe maybe the world was changing. Maybe love really could cross those invisible lines. But deep down, I knew it never would be that simple. That night, as I was finishing my shift, I stopped by the fountain near the center of campus. The same one where I'd seen them sitting that afternoon. The water shimmered under the lights, rippling in the wind. I bent down, tossing in a coin without thinking, whispering, "Keep him safe." The sound of laughter drifted across the courtyard. His laughter, hers too. I turned and saw them, framed against the glow of the library windows, unaware anyone was watching. She said something that made him laugh so hard he almost dropped his book. And from where I stood, broom in hand, invisible as ever, I felt a strange mix of joy and dread rise in my chest. Because love had found my son, and I knew what that meant. It was only a matter of time before the world tried to take it away. She laughed at his joke for the first time, and from across the courtyard, I felt both joy and fear take root. Somewhere deep down, I knew a storm was coming. She was light, laughter, and everything my son was told he could never have. I used to think love was something people like us didn't have time for. It was for the kind of people who didn't have to count change at the end of the week or worry about rent hikes. But watching Daniel and Isabel changed that. They had a way of talking that made the rest of the world disappear. Two souls who didn't know they were standing on opposite sides of a wall. They studied together most nights in the library. Sometimes I'd catch a glimpse of them when I was cleaning the first-floor corridor. They'd sit under the soft yellow lights, heads close, laughing at something in their notebooks. She always brought him coffee. He always forgot to drink it. There was something pure about it, something that made me both proud and uneasy. One night, I was sweeping near the main staircase when they walked past, lost in conversation. Isabel was wearing a red scarf that brushed against his shoulder as they walked. Daniel said something about his project, and she smiled in that quiet, knowing way people do when they're not just listening. They're feeling it too. I turned away before they could notice me, pretending to wipe the glass. But inside, I was smiling. Later that week, Daniel came home for the weekend. It had been months since I'd seen him up close, and I barely recognized him. He had new clothes, a better haircut, a little more confidence in the way he moved. He looked like a young man who was finally stepping into his own skin. We sat across from each other at the kitchen table, the same one that used to wobble when his mother leaned on it to help with homework. "So," I said, pouring him a cup of coffee. "You and that Langford girl, you two spend a lot of time together, huh?" He froze, then smiled awkwardly. "You've been checking up on me?" "Let's just say word gets around," I said, grinning. He laughed and looked down at his cup. "She's different, Dad. She doesn't care about money or names. She's kind." I nodded slowly. Kindness is rare in her world. Be careful with it. He frowned. "You don't like her?" "I don't know her," I said. "But I know how the world looks at people like us when we get too close to people like her." He leaned forward, frustrated. "You don't understand, Dad. She's not like them." "I hope you're right," I said quietly, my voice softer than I intended. He didn't answer, but the way he looked away told me he'd already decided to ignore the warning. That's what love does. It makes smart people believe they're exceptions to every rule. Over the next few months, their friendship turned into something more. The change was slow, but you could see it. They walked closer now, lingered longer. He started coming home less often, always busy with projects or study sessions that lasted late into the night. I didn't need to ask who he was studying with. There were rumors, too. Students talked. The janitors heard things in passing, whispers about the scholarship kid and the millionaire's daughter. It wasn't cruel at first, just curiosity. But curiosity turns to gossip fast, especially when love crosses lines people pretend don't exist. One afternoon, I saw them sitting under the big oak near the fountain. She was leaning on his shoulder, eyes closed, while he read something out loud from a notebook. The campus was quiet, golden leaves falling around them. I should have looked away, but I couldn't. They looked like a picture of something I'd always wanted but never had. Peace. But peace never lasts long when it threatens the balance of power. The day it happened was colder than usual. I was cleaning the executive floor when the elevator doors opened, and there he was, Richard Langford himself. It had been years since I'd seen him up close. He hadn't changed much, still tall, still polished, still carrying himself like the world owed him its time. His assistant trailed behind, arms full of papers. He didn't notice me at first. He rarely did. But when I bent to empty the trash near his office, I saw something lying on his desk that froze me mid-step. A photograph. It was Daniel and Isabel, standing by the fountain. Her hand rested on his chest, both smiling like the world made sense. The photo wasn't printed. It had been taken from someone's phone and printed on company paper. Langford's voice snapped me out of it. "Can you believe this?" He barked at his assistant, slamming a hand on the desk. My daughter, with him? A scholarship case? Whose idea was it to let people like that in here? The assistant stammered something about diversity programs, but Langford didn't hear it. His face was red, jaw tight. "I give millions to this university, and this is what I get? My daughter holding hands with a janitor's son?" The words hit me like a fist. My grip tightened on the trash bin. For a second I thought about saying something, about reminding him that the janitor's son worked harder than any of his executives, but I didn't. I just stood there, invisible again. When he finally looked up, his eyes met mine. The silence stretched. Recognition flickered. "You," he said, narrowing his eyes. "You work here?" "Yes, sir," I managed. His mouth curled into something between disgust and disbelief. "Of course you do." He turned back to his desk, grabbing the photo. "If your son thinks he can climb into my family, he's mistaken. You'd do well to remind him of that." I wanted to speak. God knows I wanted to. But years of swallowing pride kept my tongue still. "Yes, sir," I said quietly. I finished my shift without saying a word. But when I got home that night, Daniel was already there, pacing the living room. "Dad," he said, voice shaking. "Did he talk to you?" I froze. "Langford. He called me into his office today. Said I'm not the kind of person his daughter should be seen with." His fists clenched at his sides. "He told me to stay away from her. Said I should know my place." I tried to stay calm. "What did you say?" "I told him I loved her," he said, voice breaking. And he laughed. He sank into the chair, face buried in his hands. For the first time since he was a child, I saw him cry. "I thought love would be enough," he whispered. "But to them, I'm just nothing." I sat beside him, the same way I used to when he scraped his knees as a kid. "You listen to me," I said gently. "You're not nothing. You've already climbed further than I ever could. But love, real love, has a cost. You just have to decide if you can pay it." He looked up, eyes red, tears streaking his cheeks. "What if it's too expensive?" "Then you walk away," I said quietly. "With your dignity." He shook his head. "I can't, not this time." I didn't argue. You can't talk reason to a heart that's already decided. The next morning, I walked into work and saw the front page photo on the company bulletin, Isabel Langford laughing with Daniel at the campus fair. By noon, everyone was talking. And somewhere on the top floor, Richard Langford's door slammed shut. I knew what was coming. The question was, how much would it cost to survive it? The rich don't fear love. They fear losing control. When you've lived your whole life being invisible, you learn to read people's silences better than their words. The day after the photo spread through the company, the silence inside Langford Tower was deafening. People who used to nod at me in the hallways now looked away. Conversation stopped when I walked by. The sound of my broom against the marble floors felt louder than it had in 20 years. By noon, the whole building had seen the image. Isabel Langford and Daniel Carter, my son, laughing under the university's fountain lights. The photo had been shared online, passed around in boardrooms, whispered about over coffee. But gossip spreads faster when it threatens the powerful. That evening, as I finished cleaning the executive floor, I got the call. "Mr. Langford wants to see you," the receptionist said, her voice clipped. I took the elevator up, my hands damp, my stomach tight. The last time I'd been inside that office, I'd been holding his business card, a symbol of power I thought meant something. Now I was walking straight into it. He didn't look up when I entered. Papers were scattered across his desk, the photo lying face up in the middle. He tapped it once, as if emphasizing a point before even speaking. "Close the door," he said. I did. The click echoed like a sentence being handed down. "Do you know what kind of damage your son has done?" he asked. "My son?" I repeated, trying to steady my voice. "Yes, your son," he said, his tone sharp as glass. "The boy on scholarship, the one my company funds. He's made a mockery of my family, of this institution, of everything I've built." He stood, his eyes cold, hands pressed flat against the desk. "I built this tower from nothing. Do you think I'll let a janitor's son drag my name through the mud?" I met his gaze, and for the first time in years, I didn't look away. "Sir," I said quietly, "my son hasn't dragged anyone through the mud. He's worked harder than anyone in this building ever will. He's earned everything he has." Langford laughed. Short, cruel. "Earned? Do you think scholarships make you equals? Let me remind you what you are." He pointed to the mop still leaning by the door. "That's your place. That's where you belong. Don't mistake generosity for friendship." The words hit harder than I wanted to admit. I'd swallowed pride my entire life, but something in me cracked that day. "With all due respect, sir," I said, voice trembling but firm, "I may clean your floors, but I've never stepped on anyone to do it." He froze, stunned that I'd even spoken. Then, slowly, he smiled. Not kindly. "You should tell your son to stay away from my daughter, or you'll both regret it." I left before I said something that would get me fired. But the damage was already done. That night, I came home to find Daniel sitting on the couch, his eyes red. "They pulled my scholarship," he said quietly. I froze. "What?" "They said there were complaints about inappropriate conduct and conflicts of interest. But we both know what this is really about." He tossed a folder across the table. Inside was a letter. Formal, sterile, merciless. His tuition revoked, dorm access revoked, everything he'd worked for, gone. I sat down beside him. "We'll appeal. They can't just—" He cut me off. "They can, Dad. They own the system. You work for the man who owns the school." Silence fell between us, heavy and suffocating. He leaned forward, elbows on his knees, staring at the floor. "You told me to be careful. You warned me. And I didn't listen." "Don't do that," I said quickly. "Don't blame yourself." "I have to," he said, his voice breaking. "Because I didn't just lose school, I lost her too." 2 days later, he went to see Isabel. He didn't tell me where, but I knew. When he came back that night, his face said everything. "She's grounded," he said, staring blankly ahead. "Her father took her phone, her car, everything. Said she's not to see me again." I sat down across from him. "What did she say?" "She cried," he said quietly. "Said she'd wait for me, but I could see it in her eyes. She doesn't know how." He leaned back, covering his face with his hands. I hate this, Dad. I hate that the world can just decide who's worth loving. I wanted to tell him the world didn't decide that love was stronger than money or names, but I couldn't bring myself to lie, because I knew too well how money rewrites the rules. The next morning, I found him sitting at the kitchen table, staring at an envelope. "What's that?" I asked. "My letter to Langford," he said. I frowned. "You don't owe that man anything." He shook his head. "It's not for him. It's for me." He pushed the envelope toward me. I didn't open it, just stared at his handwriting, the same scrawl that used to fill his science notebooks. Then he stood, grabbed his coat, and slipped something else onto the table. A small note. "Dad," he said quietly, "I need to figure out who I am without all this noise, without his money, without pity. Daniel, I'll come back when I'm worthy of her." Before I could stop him, he was gone. That night the apartment felt too quiet. I sat in his chair, the letter still unopened, the silence pressing against the walls. Outside, the rain started, soft at first, then harder, the kind of rain that makes a city sound lonely. I looked around at the space that had been ours. His textbooks still open on the counter, his shoes by the door, his jacket hanging from the chair. It hit me that the same world that had taken everything from me was now taking him too. I finally tore open the envelope. Inside was a single line, written in ink, that had smudged from his hand. "I'll come back when I've built something no one can take away." I pressed the paper to my chest and closed my eyes, whispering the same thing I'd said every night since he was born. "Be safe, son." The clock ticked past midnight, then 1, then 2. The rain kept falling. And somewhere out there, my boy was walking into the world alone, not as the janitor's son anymore, but as a man who'd learned what love really costs. The next morning, his bed was empty, his phone off, his scholarship revoked. Only his note remained, resting on the table, a promise written by a heart that refused to quit. The world forgot him, but a father never does. Some silences don't come from peace. They come from absence, the kind that fills every room until it hums. That was my life after Daniel left. The first few days, I kept expecting to hear his key in the door. I'd still make 2 cups of coffee in the morning, set out 2 plates at dinner. I told myself he'd just call any minute, but minutes turned to days, and days to weeks. Eventually, the food got cold before I remembered to eat it. His room stayed the same. The unmade bed, the notes still pinned to the wall, the photo of him and his mother on the nightstand. Some nights, I'd sit on the edge of that bed and talk to the air like he was still there. "You'll be okay, Danny," I'd whisper. "You've got your mother's strength." But the silence always answered back. Months passed. The seasons turned, and every sunrise looked the same. A gray sky through a cracked window, the same street noise, the same ache. I went back to work at Langford Tower because it was the only place I knew how to exist. The building had changed, new faces, new names on the doors, but the air still smelled of bleach and ambition. I walked those same marble floors every day, sweeping, polishing, wiping down reflections that weren't mine. Sometimes I'd catch a glimpse of Richard Langford walking through the lobby. He'd aged too, his hair thinner, his shoulders heavier. He'd nod politely now. The arrogance had dimmed, replaced by something that looked like regret. But we never spoke. Some distances don't need words to stay wide. The other janitors would talk during breaks about their kids, their bills, their lives. I'd listen quietly, smiling where I should, laughing when expected. But inside, everything was still. I never told them my son had been gone for years. Some stories are too heavy to share. Then came the cough. At first it was nothing, a scratch in the throat after long nights. I'd wave it off, blame the cleaning chemicals or the cold air that seeped through the windows. But it got worse. By winter, it came with a sting deep in my chest. Sometimes I'd wake up gasping, the kind of breath that feels borrowed. The doctor said I should rest. "You've worked too hard for too long," he told me, scribbling prescriptions I couldn't afford. I just nodded. Rest wasn't something men like me got to earn. I kept working. The routine was all I had left. Mop, sweep, polish, repeat. The sound of the broom became a kind of heartbeat. Every stroke against the floor said the same thing. Keep going. He'll come back. Years passed. The city changed. So did I. New buildings went up, old ones came down. People stopped using cash. The skyline grew brighter, but my world stayed the same. The same apartment, the same window, the same empty chair across from mine. Some nights, when the pain in my chest got bad, I'd step outside, lean against the brick wall, and watch the city lights blur into stars. I'd whisper, "Where are you, son?" The wind never answered, but somehow the asking helped. One evening, while mopping the executive floor, I overheard two new interns talking near the elevator. "Did you hear about the Langfords?" one said. "Yeah. The daughter runs some non-profit now, helps underprivileged students or something. Guess she left her dad's company for good. Can you imagine walking away from that kind of money?" The other laughed. I froze mid-swipe, my hand tightening on the mop handle. Isabel Langford. The name I hadn't heard in years. I wanted to ask more, but janitors don't interrupt executive conversations, so I just kept cleaning, heart pounding. She was still out there. Maybe he was too. Maybe fate wasn't done with them yet. By the time I turned 60, my body felt like it had been built from dust and labor. My back screamed every time I bent down, and my hands had more scars than fingerprints. The supervisor offered retirement papers, said I'd earned it. But the thought of stopping terrified me. When work is the only thing that keeps you from thinking, rest feels like surrender. So I stayed. Christmas came and went every year like a quiet ghost. I'd light a single candle in the window, a habit I started after Daniel left. "So you'll know where home is," I used to tell him when he was little. That candle burned every year after he was gone. One December night, I woke up coughing so hard I thought my lungs would tear. The world blurred in front of me, the room spinning, my breath shallow. I sat there, for a long time, gripping the armrest, waiting for the pain to fade. It did, eventually, leaving me shaking and exhausted. I remember thinking, if this is how it ends, it's okay, because I'd done what I came into this world to do, raise a good man. Then, one snowy evening, everything changed. I came home late from work. The stairs up to my apartment felt steeper than usual. The hallway lights flickered weakly, buzzing like they were tired too. When I reached my door, I saw something strange. An envelope wedged beneath it. My name was written across the front in handwriting I hadn't seen in almost a decade. I froze. My knees went weak as I bent down to pick it up. The paper was damp from melted snow, the ink smudged but still legible. Dad. I sat in my chair for a long time, just staring at it. My hands trembled too much to tear it open. Part of me was afraid it wasn't real, that if I opened it, the dream would disappear. Finally, I took a deep breath and broke the seal. Inside was a letter, short, written in familiar, uneven handwriting. "Dad, I'm sorry it took me this long. I had to become the man you believed I could be. I've missed you every day. I'll come home soon. I promise." No address. No date. Just those words. I pressed the paper to my chest, eyes filling with tears I hadn't let fall in years. For the first time in a long time, I didn't feel alone. That night, I didn't sleep. I just sat there by the window, holding that letter like a heartbeat. Outside, the snow fell quietly, the same kind of snow that used to cover our roof when Daniel was small. And for the first time since he left, the silence in that apartment didn't feel empty anymore. It felt like a promise. The next morning, I woke to a knock at the door. I opened it and froze. Because standing there, older, stronger, and wearing the kind of suit I'd only seen in magazines, was my son. When I saw him again, I didn't recognize the man my boy had become. Some reunions don't happen with words. They happen in the silence between heartbeats, when time stops long enough for you to realize the thing you prayed for is finally standing right in front of you. That's how it felt when I opened the door. He stood there in the hallway, older now, taller, broader, sharper. His hair was neatly cut, his posture straight. The thin, restless boy who once built toy cars out of cardboard was gone. In his place stood a man in a gray suit and a long black coat, holding a small leather bag and wearing the kind of calm that comes from having finally faced the world and won. He smiled, a quiet, unsure smile that cracked something open inside me. "Hey, Dad," he said softly. "It's been a long time." For a moment, I couldn't speak. The years between us filled the air like fog. I reached out, my hand trembling, afraid that if I touched him, he'd disappear like a dream. But he didn't. He stepped forward and wrapped his arms around me. And just like that, the silence of 10 years broke. When we finally sat down, the room felt smaller but warmer. He looked around, smiling at the familiar cracks in the walls, the old lamp, the kitchen table that still wobbled. "You kept everything the same," he said. "Didn't have much reason to change it," I replied, trying not to sound as emotional as I felt. He nodded, eyes softening. "You still work at the tower?" I shrugged. "Somebody's got to keep it clean." He laughed quietly, then leaned back in his chair. "You shouldn't be working anymore, Dad. Not after all these years." I smiled. "Then tell me what else an old man like me is supposed to do." He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small envelope. "Start by retiring," he said. I frowned. "What's this?" He slid it across the table. "Open it." Inside was a check. I blinked, reading the numbers twice just to be sure I wasn't imagining them. "Daniel, what?" "It's not charity," he said quickly. "It's yours. You earned it a long time ago." He paused, his expression turning thoughtful. "After I left, I did everything I could to build something real, something that couldn't be taken away. I worked days, studied nights, lived off coffee and hope. I failed 100 times, but I kept going because I heard your voice in my head every time I wanted to quit." He looked at me then, eyes steady, proud. "You once said every sweep of that broom was a promise. You kept that promise, Dad. Now it's my turn." He told me about the years I'd missed, the jobs that didn't pay, the nights he slept in his car, the people who believed in him when no one else did. How he built a small tech startup from an idea he'd once scribbled in a notebook at our kitchen table. "It started with 3 people," he said, smiling. "Now we have over 100 employees. We call it Carter Tech." I stared at him, speechless. "Carter Tech?" He nodded. "It's not much, yet. But it's honest. And it's ours." I laughed, a broken, teary laugh that filled the whole room. "Carter Tech," I repeated, shaking my head. "The janitor's name on a company sign." He smiled. "The janitor's legacy," he corrected. For the first time in years, I felt something shift in my chest. Not pain, not sadness, but pride. Pure, unfiltered pride. I reached across the table, placing my hand over his. "Your mother would have been proud of you, son." He looked down, his voice soft. "I hope I made her proud too." We sat there for a while, just talking. About small things, the weather, the city, the neighbors. But under every word was something bigger. The quiet gratitude of 2 men who had finally found their way back to each other. As the evening grew darker, he stood and walked to the window. Snow had started falling again, just like the night his letter arrived. "It's funny," he said, looking out. "No matter how much changes, this view still looks the same." "That's how you know it's home," I said. He turned back, smiling faintly. "I don't just want you to rest, Dad. I want you to see what you built." "What do you mean?" He reached into his coat pocket again and pulled out a folded photo. It was him, standing in front of a glass building. Our last name printed in bold letters across the top. Carter Tech Innovations. "That's my office," he said. "Your name's on every wall." My throat tightened. "I don't need my name on walls." He nodded. Maybe not, but it deserves to be there anyway. Then his tone changed, softer now, but filled with something unspoken. There's someone I want you to meet, he said. I looked up. Someone? He hesitated for just a moment, the kind of pause that carries both excitement and fear. She's waiting outside. He turned toward the door, his hand on the handle. The cold air rushed in as he opened it, and for a second, all I could see was a silhouette in the snow, a woman standing under the streetlight. Her hair was longer now, her posture confident, her presence unmistakable. My heart stopped. He turned back to me, smiling softly. Dad, he said, voice trembling slightly. It's her. The door opened wider, and there she was, Isabel Langford, the millionaire's daughter, standing in the home of the janitor who once swept her father's floors. When she walked through that door, I realized love always finds its way home. The door creaked open, and for a moment it felt like time held its breath. Snow drifted in behind her, the cold air brushing past my face. But I didn't feel it, because standing there, framed in the soft glow of the hallway light, was the girl I'd once seen through glass windows and distance. The girl my son had loved in silence. Isabel Langford. But she wasn't the same girl anymore. Gone was the polished perfection of a millionaire's daughter. The woman before me carried herself with quiet strength, her hair pulled back simply, her coat dusted with snow, her expression calm but full of something raw and real. Her eyes found mine instantly, and for a moment I saw years collapse between us. The pain, the waiting, the distance, all dissolving into understanding. "Mr. Carter," she said softly, her voice trembling just enough to betray the emotion beneath it. It's been a long time." I swallowed hard. My voice barely came out. "It has. Too long." She stepped inside, closing the door gently behind her. The warmth of the room seemed to catch her off guard. The small table, the flickering lamp, the framed photo of my son as a boy. She smiled faintly when her eyes landed on it. "I remember that smile," she whispered. "He used to look at me the same way." Daniel stood quietly beside her, watching. I could see the way his gaze softened when he looked at her, the kind of look that said I lost everything once and somehow found it again. I motioned for them to sit. She hesitated for a moment, then lowered herself into the chair across from me. "You don't have to be nervous," I said gently. "You're home." Her eyes filled, glistening in the warm light. "I never thought I'd hear you say that," she admitted. "After everything my family put you through. After what my father did." I shook my head. "The past is heavy, but it doesn't have to be carried forever. What matters is what we do after we've learned." She nodded slowly, her voice quiet. "That's what I've been trying to do." Daniel reached out, taking her hand. "Dad," he said, his tone filled with pride. "She left her father's company years ago. She runs a foundation now, helps single parents, low-income families, kids who can't afford education. She built something good from everything that broke her." She looked down, embarrassed but smiling. "Your story inspired it, Mr. Carter. The way you worked, the way you believed in your son, it changed how I saw everything." I felt my throat tighten. For years, I had believed my life was small, that the world would forget men like me the second we stopped moving. But sitting there, listening to her speak, I realized something else. Even quiet lives leave echoes. "You both turned pain into something beautiful," I said softly. "That's the hardest kind of success." For a long moment, none of us spoke. The snow kept falling outside, painting the city in silence. The light flickered. I looked at Daniel, then at her, and something inside me shifted, the last remnants of fear gone. "I used to think love wasn't kind to people like us," I said, the words rough from old wounds. "But I see now. I was wrong." She smiled gently. "Love isn't kind or cruel," she said. "It's honest. It shows you who you really are." Then, slowly, she reached for my hand. Her fingers were cold, trembling slightly, but her grip was steady. "Thank you," she whispered. "For raising the kind of man who made me brave enough to be myself." I felt tears rise again, the kind that burn before they fall. "No," I said, voice breaking. "Thank you, for seeing the man I raised for who he really was." Daniel stood suddenly, his hand slipping into his coat pocket. His voice was calm, but his eyes shimmered with emotion. "Dad," he said quietly, "I didn't just bring her here to see you." I frowned. "What do you mean?" He turned to Isabel, and something in her expression changed, a mix of shock and recognition. Then, right there in our small, worn-out living room, he sank to one knee. The air froze. My heart stopped. Isabel gasped softly, her hand covering her mouth. He looked up at her, eyes steady, filled with love that had waited through time, pain, and distance. "You once told me love shouldn't have boundaries," he said. "You proved it when you walked away from everything for what was right. So I'm asking you, will you walk with me for the rest of your life?" She stared at him, tears already streaming down her cheeks. And then, with a soft laugh that sounded like relief and destiny colliding, she nodded. "Yes," she whispered. 1,000 times yes." I couldn't speak. I just sat there, hands trembling as my son, the boy who had once hidden behind textbooks and dreams, held the hand of the woman he'd crossed worlds to find again. The janitor's son and the millionaire's daughter. Two hearts that refused to listen to the rules. And for the first time in a lifetime, I felt whole. As they embraced, a quiet knock came at the door. Daniel opened it and froze. Standing there, older, grayer, but unmistakably him, was Richard Langford. The poor janitor's son was about to do the one thing no one believed possible. Some stories belong to whispers. Others, the world demands to witness. And that morning, the whole city was watching. The fountain square at Langford University, the same one where my son and Isabel had first met years ago, was alive again, transformed into a sea of white roses, cameras, and hushed anticipation. News vans lined the streets, reporters whispered into microphones, and strangers gathered, drawn by the rumor that the impossible was about to happen. At the center of it all stood my son, Daniel, dressed in a dark navy suit that fit him like purpose itself. He looked calm, but I could see the emotion beneath the surface. Beside him stood Isabel, radiant in a cream-colored dress, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. The city's hum faded as he turned to her, his voice carrying softly through the crowd. "Years ago," he began, "I was told that love like ours doesn't belong in this world, that people like me were meant to stay in the shadows, cleaning up after those who were born into the light." A hush rippled through the audience. He took a breath, eyes never leaving hers. "But love doesn't care about last names or bank accounts. Love only cares about truth. And the truth is, I've loved you since the first time you laughed at one of my terrible jokes by this fountain." The crowd smiled. Some even laughed softly, but the air around us was thick with feeling, the kind that comes when a story circles back to where it began. He stepped closer, his voice steady now. "I'm not here to prove anyone wrong. I'm here because you already proved that the world can change. One heart at a time." Then, slowly, he knelt down. The sound of cameras clicking echoed like thunder. Gasps filled the air. He opened a small velvet box, revealing a ring. Simple, timeless, elegant. "Isabel Langford," he said, voice trembling, "will you marry me?" The silence that followed was electric, the kind that stretches eternity into seconds. Her hands covered her mouth, her eyes filled. The city held its breath. And then, "Yes," she whispered, her voice breaking. 1,000 times yes." The crowd erupted. Cheers, applause, flashes of light. I could barely see through my own tears as I stood at the edge, my old hands shaking from emotion. For a moment, everything felt like it had come full circle. But the story wasn't done yet. Because from behind the wall of reporters, a voice broke through the noise. Deep, cold and commanding. "What is this circus?" The crowd fell silent as a black car door slammed. Out stepped Richard Langford. Even time seemed to recoil. He was older now, his once impeccable posture slightly bent, his hair streaked with gray, but his presence was still as sharp as glass. The people around him stepped back instinctively. His eyes darted from the cameras to his daughter, then to Daniel, and finally to me. "What are you doing, Isabel?" he demanded, his voice slicing through the air. "With him? In front of the world?" "Father," she said softly, steadying her voice, "I'm saying yes to the man I love." He turned to Daniel, fury blazing in his eyes. "You think this—" He gestured toward the scene, his voice cracking. "Makes you my equal? You think a few good years erase where you came from?" Daniel didn't flinch. "No, sir. I don't think I'm your equal," he said quietly. "I think I'm just a man who refuses to measure worth by money." Langford stepped closer. "You'll never belong in this world." "Then I'll build my own," my son replied. The tension in the air was unbearable. Cameras zoomed in. The crowd held its breath. And I, an old janitor, standing at the edge of the square, realized I couldn't stay silent any longer. I stepped forward, my footsteps echoing faintly on the stone. My voice came out rough, but steady. "That's enough." Langford turned, startled. His eyes narrowed. "You," he said, recognition dawning. "You're still around?" I nodded. "Some of us don't get to walk away from our mistakes, Mr. Langford. We clean up after them." The crowd murmured. Reporters turned their cameras toward me now. The man who had once been invisible was suddenly the center of a city's gaze. "You see money?" I continued, my voice growing stronger. "But I see worth. You see a last name, but I see character. You see a janitor's son. I see a man who worked his way through every closed door this world built." Langford's jaw tightened. "You think this little speech changes what people are?" "No," I said softly. "But it changes what they believe." The crowd erupted, not with laughter, not with mockery, but applause. Real applause. Langford looked around, his face pale, the power slipping from his hands. His gaze landed on his daughter, calm, composed, no longer afraid. He shook his head, voice trembling now. "If you go through with this, Isabel, you're no daughter of mine." She met his eyes, tears glistening but resolve unbroken. "Then I'll just be his," she said quietly. She turned back to Daniel, who was still on one knee, still waiting, and whispered, "Yes." He slipped the ring onto her finger. The crowd exploded again, joy, disbelief, and emotion all colliding in the cold winter air. Reporters shouted questions, cameras flashed, but all I could see was my son, the boy who once fixed broken toys, now holding the hand of the woman he had crossed worlds to reach. Langford stood frozen, eyes wide, his empire crumbling in the space between them. And then his voice cracked, softer now, bitter with defeat. "You've ruined everything," he said. "I'll never allow it, not while I'm alive." He turned sharply, his final words echoing across the square. "Over my dead body." No one knew it then, but those words, spoken in anger, would soon become prophecy. Sometimes, life forces the proud to see what humility really looks like. We all think we have time to apologize, to make things right, to change. But life doesn't wait for pride to step aside. A few months after the proposal, the city woke up to headlines that no one expected. Langford Industries faces financial collapse. CEO under investigation for fraudulent partnerships. The man who once owned half the skyline was suddenly watching it crumble beneath his feet. It started small, a few bad investments, a scandal in the board, whispers of misused funds. But soon, it was everywhere. The name Langford, once said with reverence, now carried shame. Investors fled, partners withdrew, and lawsuits stacked faster than the floors of his empire. And through it all, the man who had once stood untouchable now walked alone through his empty tower. One gray afternoon, I was mopping the lobby when the elevator doors opened, and out stepped Richard Langford. He looked smaller somehow. His perfect suit hung loose, his eyes sunken. The confidence that once filled every step was gone, replaced by something quieter. The look of a man who finally realized he'd been standing on sand all along. For a moment, neither of us spoke. He just stood there, staring at the marble floors I was cleaning. "I remember," he said finally, his voice faint, "when these floors used to shine brighter." I kept my eyes down. "They still do," I said. "You just have to look from a different angle." He gave a weak smile, the kind that admits defeat. "You always did have a way with words." "I just learned to listen to silence," I replied. He hesitated before speaking again. "I heard about the engagement," I nodded. "They're happy." He swallowed hard. "I suppose that's what matters." The pause between us stretched long. Finally, he said the one thing I never thought I'd hear from him. "I was wrong." His voice broke halfway, through it. "I was wrong about you, about your son, about everything." I looked up then, not at the millionaire he'd been, but the man he was now. And for the first time, I saw him clearly. Not as an enemy, not even as a symbol, just a man who'd finally learned what failure teaches best: humility. A week later, I got a call from Daniel. His voice was calm, but I could hear the weight behind it. "Dad, you're not going to believe this," he said. "Langford came to see me." I froze. "What did he want?" "To apologize," he said quietly, "and to ask for help." It turned out the investigation had left Langford broke, not homeless, not destitute, but stripped of power. He needed investors, partners, anyone willing to rebuild what was left of his company's integrity. And my son, the janitor's son, was now the one in a position to help him. The meeting took place in a small, sunlit conference room at Carter Tech. I watched from the hallway through the glass wall, the same way I once used to watch Daniel study from a distance. Langford sat across from him, shoulders slumped, hat in hand, a far cry from the man who once ruled boardrooms. Daniel listened quietly, not out of pride, but respect. "I came to make amends," Langford said. "Not for my company, for my daughter. And for you." Daniel didn't interrupt. He just nodded. Langford's voice cracked. "You remind me of everything I never had the courage to be. I was so afraid of losing control that I lost everything that mattered." When he finished, Daniel leaned forward, his tone steady. "We all fall, Mr. Langford. But what matters is what we build after." Then he did something no one, not even me, expected. He reached across the table and offered his hand. "I'll help you," he said. "Not for revenge, for closure." Langford looked stunned. "After everything I did?" Daniel smiled softly. "My father taught me forgiveness isn't weakness. It's the hardest kind of strength." A few weeks later, Carter Tech quietly acquired the failing remnants of Langford Industries, not as a trophy, but as a lesson. They restructured the company into a charity branch, focused on education and job training for underprivileged families. The press called it ironic. I called it justice. Because in that moment, the janitor's son didn't just succeed. He healed the wound that had once broken us both. One evening, I was sitting in my chair, reading the paper, when Daniel called again. "Dad," he said, "you should have seen his face today. He's different, humbled." I smiled quietly. "That's what happens when a man stops measuring worth in dollars." There was a pause. Then his voice softened. "You're the reason I learned that." The words hit deep. "No, son. You're the reason it mattered." That night, I stepped outside, breathing in the cool air. The city lights shimmered on the wet pavement, reflections of everything we'd endured. And for the first time, I realized the truth. Some people spend their lives building towers. Others spend their lives building character. One lasts longer than the other. Weeks later, an envelope arrived at our door, engraved in gold, sealed with the Langford family crest. Inside was a single line: "It's time to celebrate two families becoming one." I never imagined the man in rags would one day walk his son down the aisle to a billionaire's daughter. The morning of the wedding began quiet, too quiet for what the day was about to become. Sunlight spilled through the blinds of my apartment, catching the edges of an old suit hanging by the window. It wasn't much, dark gray, simple, borrowed from a friend at work. But when I ran my hand across the fabric, I smiled. Because for the first time in my life, I was getting dressed not for work, but for history. I stood in front of the cracked mirror, buttoning the shirt that had seen better days. My fingers trembled slightly, not from age, but emotion. I adjusted my tie, the same one I wore when Daniel graduated. Only this time, the knot held tighter. This time it wasn't just his achievement. It was ours. A soft knock came at the door. When I opened it, Daniel stood there in a navy blue tuxedo, looking more like a dream than my boy. His hair was neatly styled, his expression calm, but full of emotion. "Ready?" he asked. "Been ready my whole life," I said, trying to keep my voice from shaking. He stepped forward and hugged me, the kind of hug that carries a lifetime of love and forgiveness. "Dad," he whispered, "I couldn't have done any of this without you." I smiled through the sting in my eyes. "That's the point, son. You were never supposed to do it without me." The venue was breathtaking. A garden overlooking the Hudson River, white flowers arching over a glass aisle. Guests in elegant suits and dresses filled the space, their voices hushed with awe. But what caught my breath wasn't the view. It was the people. Executives, investors, reporters, the same kind of crowd that used to pass me without a glance, were now turning to look at me. The janitor, the man who used to clean their hallways. And for the first time, they saw me, not as invisible, not as background, but as family. I took my seat near the front, heart pounding as the ceremony began. Isabel appeared at the end of the aisle, radiant in white, the sunlight catching in her veil. There was no trace of the girl who once hid behind her father's shadow. She walked with grace, confidence, and peace. And beside her, walking proudly, was Richard Langford himself. He looked older, humbled, but there was something in his eyes that hadn't been there before. Softness. The kind that comes when a man finally lets go of pride. When they reached the altar, he turned to Daniel and me. Our eyes met for the first time since that awful day in his office years ago. He hesitated, then stepped toward me, extending his hand. "I believe," he said quietly. "This belongs to both of us." For a moment, the world went still. Then I stood, took his hand, and shook it firmly. Two fathers, one from power, one from humility, both finally equal. The ceremony began. The officiant spoke about love, resilience, and forgiveness, about how two hearts can rewrite the story of generations. When it was time for vows, Daniel turned to Isabel, his voice steady. "I once thought love was something you had to earn," he said, "but you showed me it was something you build, together, brick by brick, laugh by laugh, even through pain." She smiled, her voice soft but sure. "You taught me that kindness is wealth, and that true success isn't what the world gives you. It's what you give back." There wasn't a dry eye in the crowd. Not even mine. When it was over, the music started, soft, elegant, full of warmth. People cheered as they walked back down the aisle hand in hand, petals floating in the air. And then Daniel turned back, grinning. "Come on, Dad," he called. "You're not sitting this one out." I laughed, shaking my head. "Oh, I'm too old for that." But he didn't take no for an answer. He grabbed my hand and pulled me toward the dance floor. For the first time in years, I laughed. Not the quiet kind that hides pain, but the loud, unfiltered kind that belongs to joy. As the song played, I looked around, at my son, my new daughter, and the people who had once thought this impossible. And I realized something. This wasn't just a wedding. It was a bridge, a connection between worlds that were never meant to meet. When the night began to settle and the lights dimmed, I stepped outside for a moment of quiet. The air was cool, the river glittering beneath the moon. I placed a hand over my chest, the ache there familiar now but sharper tonight. Maybe it was the excitement. Maybe it was time catching up. But as the pain deepened, I found myself smiling, because even pain couldn't touch what we had built. I took a slow breath, looking back through the glass doors. Inside, Daniel and Isabel were dancing, laughing, radiant, alive. And in that instant, I whispered to the wind, "You did it, son. You really did it." As I turned to head back inside, the pain in my chest grew stronger. My hand gripped the railing, but the world blurred. I could still hear the music, faint, joyful, fading into light, as I whispered my final words. "I'm proud of you." Sometimes life forces the proud to see what humility really looks like. We all think we have time to apologize, to make things right, to change. But life doesn't wait for pride to step aside. A few months after the proposal, the city woke up to headlines that no one expected. Langford Industries faces financial collapse. CEO under investigation for fraudulent partnerships. The man who once owned half the skyline was suddenly watching it crumble beneath his feet. It started small, a few bad investments, a scandal in the board, whispers of misused funds. But soon, it was everywhere. The name Langford, once said with reverence, now carried shame. Investors fled, partners withdrew, and lawsuits stacked faster than the floors of his empire. And through it all, the man who had once stood untouchable now walked alone through his empty tower. One gray afternoon, I was mopping the lobby when the elevator doors opened, and out stepped Richard Langford. He looked smaller somehow. His perfect suit hung loose, his eyes sunken. The confidence that once filled every step was gone, replaced by something quieter, the look of a man who finally realized he'd been standing on sand all along. For a moment, neither of us spoke. He just stood there, staring at the marble floors I was cleaning. "I remember," he said finally, his voice faint, "when these floors used to shine brighter." I kept my eyes down. "They still do," I said. "You just have to look from a different angle." He gave a weak smile, the kind that admits defeat. "You always did have a way with words." "I just learned to listen to silence," I replied. He hesitated before speaking again. "I heard about the engagement." I nodded. "They're happy?" He swallowed hard. "I suppose that's what matters." The pause between us stretched long. Finally, he said the one thing I never thought I'd hear from him. "I was wrong." His voice broke halfway through it. "I was wrong about you. About your son, about everything." I looked up then, not at the millionaire he'd been, but the man he was now. And for the first time, I saw him clearly. Not as an enemy, not even as a symbol. Just a man who'd finally learned what failure teaches best: humility. A week later, I got a call from Daniel. His voice was calm, but I could hear the weight behind it. "Dad, you're not going to believe this," he said. "Langford came to see me." I froze. What did he want? "To apologize," he said quietly, "and to ask for help." It turned out the investigation had left Langford broke. Not homeless, not destitute, but stripped of power. He needed investors, partners, anyone willing to rebuild what was left of his company's integrity. And my son, the janitor's son, was now the one in a position to help him. The meeting took place in a small, sun-lit conference room at Carter Tech. I watched from the hallway through the glass wall, the same way I once used to watch Daniel study from a distance. Langford sat across from him, shoulders slumped, hat in hand, a far cry from the man who once ruled boardrooms. Daniel listened quietly, not out of pride, but respect. "I came to make amends," Langford said, "not for my company, for my daughter, and for you." Daniel didn't interrupt. He just nodded. Langford's voice cracked. "You remind me of everything I never had the courage to be. I was so afraid of losing control that I lost everything that mattered." When he finished, Daniel leaned forward, his tone steady. "We all fall, Mr. Langford. But what matters is what we build after." Then he did something no one, not even me, expected. He reached across the table and offered his hand. "I'll help you," he said. Not for revenge, for closure. Langford looked stunned. After everything I did? Daniel smiled softly. My father taught me forgiveness isn't weakness. It's the hardest kind of strength. A few weeks later, Carter Tech quietly acquired the failing remnants of Langford Industries, not as a trophy, but as a lesson. They restructured the company into a charity branch, focused on education and job training for underprivileged families. The press called it ironic. I called it justice. Because in that moment, the janitor's son didn't just succeed. He healed the wound that had once broken us both. One evening, I was sitting in my chair, reading the paper, when Daniel called again. "Dad," he said, "you should have seen his face today. He's different. Humbled." I smiled quietly. That's what happens when a man stops measuring worth in dollars. There was a pause. Then his voice softened. "You're the reason I learned that." The words hit deep. "No, son. You're the reason it mattered." That night, I stepped outside, breathing in the cool air. The city lights shimmered on the wet pavement, reflections of everything we'd endured. And for the first time, I realized the truth. Some people spend their lives building towers. Others spend their lives building character. One lasts longer than the other. Cliffhanger. Weeks later, an envelope arrived at our door, engraved in gold, sealed with the Langford family crest. Inside was a single line. "It's time to celebrate two families becoming one. Would you like me to continue with part 11? The wedding of two worlds next, the emotional visual climax where legacy, forgiveness, and love finally unite?" You said, "Okay, True Shift said, beautiful." Now we're stepping into the emotional high point of the entire story, the moment where pain turns into peace and everything comes full circle. This scene should feel like the final act of a heartfelt American drama, grand, cinematic, but grounded in humanity. Tone reference, the pursuit of happiness. The blind side of the Green Book. 11. The wedding of two worlds. 800 words. Hook. I never imagined the man in rags would one day walk his son down the aisle to a billionaire's daughter. The morning of the wedding began quiet. Too quiet for what the day was about to become. Sunlight spilled through the blinds of my apartment, catching the edges of an old suit hanging by the window. It wasn't much, dark gray, simple, borrowed from a friend at work. But when I ran my hand across the fabric, I smiled. Because for the first time in my life, I was getting dressed not for work, but for history. I stood in front of the cracked mirror, buttoning the shirt that had seen better days. My fingers trembled slightly, not from age, but emotion. I adjusted my tie, the same one I wore when Daniel graduated. Only this time, the knot held tighter. This time it wasn't just his achievement. It was ours. A soft knock came at the door. When I opened it, Daniel stood there in a navy blue tuxedo, looking more like a dream than my boy. His hair was neatly styled, his expression calm but full of emotion. "Ready?" he asked. "Been ready my whole life," I said, trying to keep my voice from shaking. He stepped forward and hugged me, the kind of hug that carries a lifetime of love and forgiveness. "Dad," he whispered, "I couldn't have done any of this without you." I smiled through the sting in my eyes. "That's the point, son. You were never supposed to do it without me." The venue was breathtaking. A garden overlooking the Hudson River, white flowers arching over a glass aisle. Guests in elegant suits and dresses filled the space, their voices hushed with awe. But what caught my breath wasn't the view. It was the people. Executives, investors, reporters, the same kind of crowd that used to pass me without a glance, were now turning to look at me. The janitor, the man who used to clean their hallways. And for the first time, they saw me. Not as invisible, not as background, but as family. I took my seat near the front, heart pounding as the ceremony began. Isabel appeared at the end of the aisle, radiant in white, the sunlight catching in her veil. There was no trace of the girl who once hid behind her father's shadow. She walked with grace, confidence, and peace. And beside her, walking proudly, was Richard Langford himself. He looked older, humbled, but there was something in his eyes that hadn't been there before. Softness. The kind that comes when a man finally lets go of pride. When they reached the altar, he turned to Daniel and me. Our eyes met for the first time since that awful day in his office years ago. He hesitated, then stepped toward me, extending his hand. "I believe," he said quietly, "this belongs to both of us." For a moment the world went still. Then I stood, took his hand, and shook it firmly. Two fathers, one from power, one from humility, both finally equal. The ceremony began. The officiant spoke about love, resilience, and forgiveness, about how two hearts can rewrite the story of generations. When it was time for vows, Daniel turned to Isabel, his voice steady. "I once thought love was something you had to earn," he said. "But you showed me it was something you build, together, brick by brick, laugh by laugh, even through pain." She smiled, her voice soft but sure. "You taught me that kindness is wealth, and that true success isn't what the world gives you. It's what you give back." There wasn't a dry eye in the crowd, not even mine. When it was over, the music started, soft, elegant, full of warmth. People cheered as they walked back down the aisle hand in hand, petals floating in the air. And then Daniel turned back, grinning. "Come on, Dad," he called. "You're not sitting this one out." I laughed, shaking my head. "Oh, I'm too old for that." But he didn't take no for an answer. He grabbed my hand and pulled me toward the dance floor. For the first time in years, I laughed. Not the quiet kind that hides pain, but the loud, unfiltered kind that belongs to joy. As the song played, I looked around, at my son, my new daughter, and the people who had once thought this impossible. And I realized something. This wasn't just a wedding. It was a bridge, a connection between worlds that were never meant to meet. When the night began to settle and the lights dimmed, I stepped outside for a moment of quiet. The air was cool, the river glittering beneath the moon. I placed a hand over my chest, the ache there familiar now, but sharper tonight. Maybe it was the excitement. Maybe it was time catching up. But as the pain deepened, I found myself smiling, because even pain couldn't touch what we had built. I took a slow breath, looking back through the glass doors. Inside, Daniel and Isabel were dancing, laughing, radiant, alive. And in that instant, I whispered to the wind, "You did it, son. You really did it." Cliffhanger. As I turned to head back inside, the pain in my chest grew stronger. My hand gripped the railing, but the world blurred. I could still hear the music, faint, joyful, fading into light, as I whispered my final words. "I'm proud of you." Would you like me to continue with Part 12, The Legacy of the Man They Ignored, the emotional, tear-jerking finale? Next? You said, okay, TrueShift said, perfect, this is it, the final chapter. The emotional resolution of everything you've built, not just the end of a story, but the birth of a legacy. It needs to leave your audience in tears, but also in awe. The tone should be poetic, cinematic, and deeply human, like the final moments of Forrest Gump or The Shawshank Redemption. 12. The Legacy of the Man They Ignored. 1,000 words. Hook. They once called him the poor janitor. Now they call him the man who raised a legend. The morning after the wedding, the city felt softer somehow. The rain had washed the streets clean, the air smelled new, and for once I woke up without an alarm, without a broom waiting by the door. The suit I wore the day before hung neatly over the chair, the flower from my lapel still fresh. My heart was tired, but it wasn't sad. Not anymore. It was full, the kind of full you feel only after a promise has been kept. I sat by the window with a cup of coffee that had long gone cold, watching the light crawl across the skyline. The same skyline I'd once watched through fogged train windows on my way to work. Only now, it looked different. Not because the city had changed, but because I had. For the first time, I didn't feel invisible. I thought about Daniel, about the way he'd smiled at the altar, his hand trembling as he slipped the ring onto Isabel's finger. I thought about her, about how she had looked at me before walking down the aisle, eyes full of the kind of respect that can't be bought. And I thought about Langford, the man who had once crushed me under his pride, shaking my hand like a brother, not a master. I closed my eyes and whispered, it was worth it. Every night shift, every ache, every unspoken prayer. It was all worth it. When morning light reached the photo on my desk, Daniel in his cap and gown, I smiled. I leaned back, the chair creaking under my weight, and let out a slow breath. My chest felt heavy, but peaceful. And that's how they found me, sitting by the window, still wearing yesterday's smile, gone quietly, gone proud. The news broke within hours. Beloved Janitor, father of tech visionary Daniel Carter, passes away peacefully. The city that had once walked past me without a glance suddenly stopped. News outlets called it poetic. Strangers lit candles outside the Langford Tower. Workers who had known me for years left flowers by the service door I used every morning. For a man who had lived his whole life unseen, I was finally seen. The funeral was small but beautiful. Sunlight streamed through stained glass, painting the floor in colors I used to only see on television. Daniel stood at the front, his voice steady despite the weight in it. My father spent his life cleaning floors so that I could walk without fear, he said. He believed that dignity isn't about what you earn. It's about what you give. He gave everything and asked for nothing. People cried openly. Even those who had never met me felt the truth in his words. When it was Langford's turn to speak, the room went still. He stood by the coffin, voice trembling. There are men who build towers, he said, and men who build people. Richard Carter built both. Only one of them wasn't made of steel. And for the first time, he bowed his head, not as a CEO, but as a man finally at peace with himself. A month later, Daniel made an announcement. Standing before cameras, reporters, and employees, he revealed the newest project under Carter Tech, the Carter Foundation. Its mission was simple: to honor workers, single parents, and underprivileged families who sacrifice everything for their children's futures. No one who works hard, Daniel said, should ever feel invisible. My father's story will make sure they never do. The foundation started small: scholarships, support programs, education funds. But it grew faster than anyone expected. Within a year, hundreds of students were attending college with help from the Janitor's Scholarship. Buildings were renovated. Workers were paid fairly. Families who had once lived in the shadows now stood in the light. The first major donor? Richard Langford. He stood on stage beside my son, tears glistening in his eyes as he handed over a check. Consider this redemption, he said softly, for every man I failed to see. The new Carter Tech headquarters opened on the 5th anniversary of my passing. It stood tall in the heart of the city, a building of glass and steel that reflected the sky like hope itself. And right in the center of the lobby hung a photograph. Mine. Me in my janitor's uniform, broom in hand, smiling shyly at the camera. Beneath it, carved in brass, were 3 simple words. Humility built this. Every morning, employees stopped to touch the frame before beginning their workday, a quiet ritual of gratitude. Visitors asked, "Who was he?" And the receptionist would smile and say, "That's Mr. Carter, the man who taught our founder what success really means." Sometimes, Daniel would come late at night, after the offices emptied, and stand beneath that photo in silence. Isabel often joined him, her hand slipping into his. "He'd be proud," she'd whisper. "I hope so," he'd reply. "Everything I am started with him." They would stand there, looking up at the picture, surrounded by the quiet hum of the city, a city that finally remembered the man it once ignored. Years later, documentaries were made. Books were written. Students studied the Carter model, not for business strategy, but for ethics. They called it the humility equation. Success, hard work, character, sasho, pride. And every time someone mentioned my name, Daniel would smile and say, he was just a janitor, but he taught the world how to be human. The final scene of the Foundation's anniversary video faded to black. Daniel's voice spoke first, calm, proud, steady. My father never wanted fame or fortune. He only wanted to leave the world a little cleaner than he found it. And somehow, he did. Then came my voice, recorded years earlier from a message I once left on his old answering machine. They ignored me when I lived, but I built a life worth remembering. The screen went dark, and in that silence, my story, the janitor's story, became eternal. If this story touched your heart, don't just scroll. Hit like to honor every parent who sacrificed in silence. Subscribe for more true stories that remind us what really matters. And share this video. Someone out there needs this hope tonight.